Welcome to Drive the Daf, clear, structured explanation of the daily daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Lamed Ches primarily discusses what happens when you have Yom Tov and Shabbos, one immediately following the other in any order, and you want to set up an Eruv Techumin for both of them. The primary issue is, are the 2 days considered to be one Kedusha, and therefore one Eruv Techumin in the beginning of the 2-day period works for both, or are they considered to be separate Kedushas, and therefore you need a separate Eruv Techumin set up at the beginning of each of the 2 days? If that's the case, you have an additional problem, because how would you be able to set up the second Eruv Techumin before that day begins? You're in the day before, and that means that you're preparing from one day to the next, from the first day to the second, from Shabbos to Yom Tov, or from Yom Tov to Shabbos, which we know is problematic. So the Daf begins with a Mishnah, which quotes the primary machlokus on the subject, whether Yom Tov and Shabbos following each other are one Kedusha or two separate Kedushas. And then the Gemara will discuss some of the back and forth between the two Tanaim, and then we'll bring another Brisa which adds some more Tanaim, and the Gemara will count the various Tanaim on the subject. So the first Tana brought here in the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer, and he holds that there are two separate Kedushas, and you can have two separate Eruvin. You can have an Eruv for one and not for the other. You can have an Eruv on one direction or an Eruv in the other direction for the first day and for the second day. You can do whatever you want. They're two separate things, two separate Eruvin, completely separate discussions. Now, arguing on Rabbi Eliezer are the Chachamim, and they say no, it's one Kedusha, and therefore you can only have one Eruv for both days. Whatever you have for one day, you have to have for the other day. You have to, if you have an Eruv on the east side, then that's got to be for both days. If you have an Eruv on the west side, that has to be for both days. If you have no Eruv, that has to be for both days, and if you have an Eruv, it has to be for both days. You can't have an Eruv for the first day and then say, no, for the second day I want to be able to go 2,000 amos in any direction, not just to my Eruv. So therefore, I want to have an Eruv only the first day, not the second day. You can't say that. Whatever you have for the first day, you have to have for the second day. And the last line is Rabbi Eliezer's comment to the Chachamim. The Chachamim said, you make an Eruv in any direction or in any day the same way, and their indication seems to be that you have to make two separate Eruvin. But they have to be the same. The Eruv for your first day and the Eruv for your second, they have to be the same. So on that, Rabbi Eliezer says, you're clearly agreeing with me. You're clearly saying that they are separate Kedushas, because you're saying you have to make two Eruvin, separate days. But you're telling me that they have to be the same. If there are two separate Kedushas, why should they have to be the same? You should be able to make different Eruvin for each of the days. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara first of all clears up linguistic issues. Why would the Chachamim say that you have to have that your two Eruvin have to be the same direction for the 2 days? Obviously, if we're saying it has to be the same direction, then it has to be for both days. You don't need to tell me that one day you could have an Eruv and the other day you would have to keep the same Eruv. You would have to have the same Eruv. You couldn't not have an Eruv. They have to be in the same direction. They have to obviously both exist. So the Gemara answers that by saying this is really the Chachamim making a point to Rabbi Eliezer. And they're saying, wouldn't you agree that if somebody wants to make two separate Eruvin within one day that he can't do that? He can't say first half of the day my Eruv is in the east and second half of the day my Eruv is in the west. It's got to be uniform for the day. It has to be uniform for the day. You can't split it. So then it also has to be uniform from day to day. The directions have to be the same. You can't make two separate Eruvin for two separate days if they're together, Shabbos and Yom Tov. So on that, Rabbi Eliezer says, you're right about the first halacha, you can't split the day. But that's because one day is one Kedusha, but two separate days are two separate Kedushas. And therefore you could split it. Now, Rabbi Eliezer ties to the Chachamim, and he says, don't you agree that if something happened to the Eruv of the first day, that it got destroyed, that it doesn't work for the second day anymore? Like, for example, if the Eruv was food, and the food got eaten in the first day, so it's not around for the second day. Or if he made the Eruv by being physically present in the place that he wants to be the center of his tchum. He went somewhere, he traveled to a spot a few 2,000 amas away, he stayed there until the first day began, and then he left. So now, when the second day begins, he's somewhere else. His Eruv was originally set up by where he was physically present. Now, in the beginning of the second day, he's physically present somewhere else. Don't you agree that his Eruv is where he's physically present now, because his physical presence in the first place no longer exists? And the Chachamim say, yes, we agree. So he says, okay, so there's your proof. You see that it is two separate Kedushas, and at the beginning of each of the days, where his Makam Shvisa, where his residence for Shabbos is, or for Yom Tov is, that is where his Erev begins. So how could you tell me that it's one Kedusha? So the Gemara answers that the Chachamim are really, they have a suffix. It's not that they're sure that it's one long Kedusha, they're not sure. It could be one Kedusha, it could be two Kedushas, therefore they go stringently both ways. The rule of Chachamim both ways. If your first Erev disappears, on the second day you no longer have an Erev. Wherever your Erev is the second day, that's where you are. The first one doesn't work for the second day. However, you can't have two separate Erevin for the first day and the second day, because it could be that it's one Kedusha, and therefore the Erev for the first day works for the second day, and you can't switch it and move it somewhere else. So now, the Gemara says that the Chachamim said to Rabbi Eliezer, wouldn't you agree that if somebody forgot to make an Erev before Shabbos Yontif together, he forgot to make an Erev on Erev of the 2 days, and now on the first day he says, you know what, I need to go somewhere on the second day, can I make an Erev now? I want to make an Erev now for the second day. Wouldn't you agree that he can't do that? And he says, yes, I agree that he can't do that. So you see that the reason is because it's one Kedusha, and you don't have an opportunity possibly to make an Erev special for the second day. You didn't have an Erev at the beginning of the first day. You can't have an Erev at the beginning of the second day. It's one Kedusha. On that, Rabbi Eliezer says, no, that's not the reason. It's not because it's one Kedusha. It's clearly two Kedushas. The problem is that it's Hachona. You're using the first day to prepare for the second day. That you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to prepare from one day, from Shabbos Yontif, to the second day. Gemara now quotes a brisa, which is very similar to the case we just discussed, and it adds a couple of opinions of Tanaim here, and then the Gemara will add a few more and work out the contradictions between the ones that seem to apparently contradict each other. So the brisa again discusses a case where your Erev disappeared after the first day. It says that somebody either set up an Erev with his physical presence, and the beginning of the second day he was somewhere else, or he placed down food there and the food was gone. So what is the halacha for the second day? Does his first Erev stick or not? So Rabbi says, this is Rabbi Huda Hanasi, Rabbi says that the Erev certainly does not work. There are definitely two separate days. He has to make a new Erev, and the Erev he made at the beginning of the first day doesn't last for the second day. And if it was a physical Erev, by his physical presence, wherever he's physically present will be the center of his new Tchum. That's Rebbe's opinion. Rabbi Yehuda says, actually what happens is that it's a suffix, and therefore he's caught between the two. He's like we saw before, he's the donkey driver and the camel driver. One wants to go ahead of him, one wants to go behind him, and he's stuck between the two of them. So this person's also stuck between the two. He has to stick to his first Erev, because it might be the existing Erev, and he also has to stick to his current Makom Shvisa, his current permanent residence, wherever he is now, because that is also possibly his Erev, because that's where he sets up his permanent residence at the beginning of the second day. Therefore, the only place he's allowed to walk is the overlap of the two Erevin. He holds it's a suffix. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Now, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Breika, say it is definitely one Kedusha, and therefore the first Erev sticks. You cannot change the Erev the second day. Now, says Rav. Those are the three opinions. Says Rav, the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah, that it's definitely two separate Kedushas. And there are 4 Tanaim who hold that way. And we're going to see contradictions here. The first ones he lists are Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rav Shmuel, the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Breika. That obviously contradicts what we just learned. The Gemara will ask that. Those are the first 2 on Rav's list. The next 2 are Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Lazar ben Reb Shimon, and Rabbi Yaisi bar Rabbi Yehuda Stimta. Stimta meaning rice is often like him. Rabbi saw him in many places and used him as a stam mishnah. Those are the 4 opinions. Now, not clear that these are the 4. Says the Gemara, some people put in Rabbi Elazar and take out Rabbi Yaisi bar Rabbi Yehuda Stimta. Okay, that would be stam Rabbi Elazar, not Rabbi Elazar the son of Reb Shimon. So now the Gemara says, contradiction. You're telling me here that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel and Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan ben Breika definitely hold like Rabbi Eliezer, that it's 2 separate Kedushas, but we just saw a brisa where they definitely hold that it's one Kedusha. So Gemara says, yeah, you have to flip that Brisa. That Brisa has the opinion wrong. So Gemara says, but then what do you mean? How are they different than Rebbe? Rebbe is the one who said that it was definitely two separate Kedushas. So the Gemara says, yes, correct, you should change the Girsa to V'chein Amar. They agree with Rebbe, and they also say the same halacha. Says the Gemara, well, if that's true, so then how come Rav in his list of people who hold this way left out Rebbe? The Gemara says, Rebbe said it, but he doesn't hold of what he said. The Gemara says, okay, Rebbe said a statement that he doesn't hold of, he's just quoting someone else, so then how do we know that Rebbe Shmuel and Rebbe Shimon ben Gamliel hold of it? Maybe they're also just quoting someone else. The Gemara says, well, Rav knew that that is what they held. He had a Masorah that was their actual opinion. The Gemara now says that when Rav Huna passed away, Rav Chizah went into the Beis Medrash and he asked a contradiction on this halacha that Rav said. Rav here said that the halacha is clearly that it is one long kedusha. The Gemara says we have a different statement of Rav elsewhere that contradicts this. What did Rav say elsewhere? Rav said that an egg which is laid on a day of Shabbos or Yom Tov when they are next to each other is forbidden on both days. Gemara says, why would that be? We know the halacha is that an egg which is born on Shabbos or Yom Tov is forbidden that day. Why should it be forbidden the next day? It must be that Rav really holds that it's one long kedusha, and that's why it's forbidden on both days, which contradicts what he said earlier, that the halacha is like Rabbi Eliezer, that it's two separate kedushas. So Gemara says, no, that's not the reason. Really, it's two separate kedushas. The problem is that since it's born in one day, he would eat it the next day, then the first day would be preparing for the second day. The preparation of this food took place on one day, Shabbos or Yom Tov, and it's preparing for the next day. So you can't have that. You have to wait until a weekday, regular chol day afterwards. Now the Gemara gets deeper into the halacha v'chana, asking how it works with all these halachas we're discussing over here. Abaye says, I don't understand. The Mishnah said that he's allowed to go and set up an Erev for the second day. He's allowed to go to the place and set up an Erev there. How could you set up an Erev to take effect the second day? You are obviously setting up the Erev for the second day on the first day. So Gemara answers, the Gemara says as follows. Gemara says, an Erev takes effect at the last moment of Bein Hashmashos, when Shabbos of the second day, or whatever the second day is, actually begins. At that moment, the Erev and the second day are taking effect at the same time, so nothing's being prepared beforehand. The Gemara will ask later that you have to go there. But the Erev actually begins at the last moment when it's actually beginning and it's becoming Vadai the second day, and therefore nothing's being performed during Bein Hashmashos, which is partially the first day. It's all taking effect in the second day. The Gemara says, well, hold on a second. How could it be that it's taking effect the second day? We saw recently a Brisa quoted that says that if somebody sets aside wine for an Erev in a Kli, which was Tameh but put in the mikvah, but it doesn't become actually Tahar until the day ends. So he said you can't use that for an Erev. And we understood that the reason you can't use that for an Erev is because you're setting it aside as Truma. That's what it was. So the wine in there is Truma wine. So you can't have it become Tameh in the Kli. It cannot take effect that it's Truma and that it's therefore, and that it's going to be an Erev afterwards until after it becomes a Tahar. And therefore it couldn't be an Erev until the day is over, because the Erev takes place before the actual end of the day. It takes place at the beginning of Bein Hashmashos. That's how we understood that. So here you're telling me that the Erev takes effect at the last moment of Bein Hashmashos when the new day begins. If that was true, then I should be able to use this Tameh Kli, because at the moment that the Erev takes effect, the Kli becomes Tar. You don't have an issue anymore. The Gemara answers, and the Gemara says, no, the problem here is not that it's Tameh. The problem is that you need something called Suda Ha'aruya Mi'ba'id Yom. It has to be food which was ready and available to be eaten from before, from previously. It's halacha we've seen also. That food has to be permitted and ready from before. This wasn't permitted and ready from before. You couldn't eat it then because you had to wait for the Kli to become Tahar. So Gemara says, one second, if you need the food to be ready from before, how could Rabbi Eliezer tell me that I could have two separate Eruvin on two separate ends of a town? It means if I have an Erev 2,000 Amos to the east and an Erev 2,000 Amos to the west, during the first day, if I'm using the Erev that's 2,000 Amos to the east, the Erev that's 2,000 Amos to the west is outside my Tchum. I can't get to it. So it's not an Erev that is Ru'uya Mi'ba'id Yom. I'm not able to get to it until Shabbos or the second day actually begins. So obviously you don't need it to be Ru'uya L'Chalayim. So Gemara says, you're right, that case would be a problem, but that's not the case that B'ez was referring to. He was talking about when the two Eruvin are 1,000 Amos apart. are 1,000 amas from the center, which is where I am now. They are 2,000 amas from each other, and therefore they are within each other's tchum, and not a problem of if you're using the tchum of the first Erev, how could you use the tchum of the second Erev? The Gemara asks, but hold on a second, if you have a problem of hachana, so how could you ever set up the Erev on the first day for the second day? Now, if you left out food, I understand. You left out food, and it begins automatically when the second day begins, the Erev takes effect. If, however, you have to go there, and your physical presence establishes your permanent residence, and therefore your Erev for Shabbos, how could you go there? You have to show up before the time. That means you have to come on the first day in order to be there for the beginning of the second day. So how could you do that? Now the Gemara here is assuming that you have to go and say, this should be my Erev. The Gemara answers that this is the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who holds you don't have to say anything. You go and you're there, it's an Erev automatically. That's part of a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim about objects. Objects also have a tchum. You can't move an object out of its 2,000 ams. Now usually the place in which the object establishes its residence and therefore its tchum depends on the owner. What about an object which doesn't belong to anybody? So according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, it gets its own tchum automatically. So therefore a person who just stands somewhere gets his own tchum automatically. You don't need anybody to say, have intent to do anything to establish it. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, you're not actually doing anything. You're just showing up. Just showing up is not a problem. Walking somewhere to take care of something is not a problem of setting up for the second day. You're allowed to go somewhere in order to be there for the second day. Doing a kavana, an action, saying something, that's the problem. Therefore, you're allowed to go, even though you're setting up for the second day. By walking, you're allowed to just go and walk there. Now, the Gemara says, now that Abaye, that Rabba bar Rav Chanin said to Abaye that you can't say this, and had Rav seen the following brisa, he would never have said this halacha. Because it says in this brisa that you're not allowed to go to your field, the edge of your field. You're not allowed to go to the edge of the city on Shabbos in order to be able to see what it needs to be taken care of for after Shabbos, or to go to the gate of the city to be able to get to the bathhouse right after Shabbos. So he's clearly saying you're not allowed to go walk somewhere as part of Hachana for after Shabbos, so therefore you wouldn't be able to walk there to set up the Tchum either. Where it says not necessarily, it could be that that's a problem, but setting up the tchum is not. Going there, it's clear what your intent is. It's clearly that you're going to use the bathhouse and you're going to check your field. That's why you're there. Why else would you be there? Just walking out of the city to set up a tchum is not necessary. You can't tell the reason he's going there is to set up a tchum. Maybe the reason he's going there is because he's a Talmid Chacham and he's busy thinking and learning and he's not paying attention to where he's going. Or maybe the reason is because he's in Amaretz and he's looking for the donkey that he lost. Whatever it is a separate reason. Now the Gemara gives another answer here that maybe it's not really Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And maybe even the Chachamim who argue on Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and say that normally you have to say something would also agree here that you don't have to say something. Because in the case of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri and the Chachamim's machlokes, that was talking about an object or a person who's asleep that can't set up a tchum that way. You have to be aware of what's going on. But maybe the Chacham say you don't have to actually say anything. You have to be able to say something. You have to not be an object, and you have to not be asleep. You have to be aware of what's going on, and able to say, I'm making my tchum now. But to actually say, you don't have to, and therefore it would be enough to go to the end of the tchum to set it up.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.
Maseches Eruvin.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.